Hello there, I'm James Lind, and today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to some of the tools that I use to color grade my images in Lightroom and Photoshop. But before I get into that, I'm just going to give you a very simplistic rundown of some basic color theory because it's important to have the basic color theories in mind when you edit your photos so that you can make conscious decisions as to how you're going to use color in your images to bring out the best qualities of your images and tell your story. Now, I'm not going to delve too deeply into the science of color theory, but if you want to look into that a little bit more, I'm going to pop some links down below so you can do your own reading. Now, the main thing to wrap your head around is the color wheel. Now, different types of color wheel do exist, but we're going to focus on what's probably the most well-known one, which is the artist's color wheel, which I'm going to show here. And that's based on the three primary colors of red, blue, and yellow. The most simple way to use a color wheel is to pick what are called complementary colors. Complementary colors are on opposite sides of the color wheel and by their very nature will contrast each other perfectly and really help your images to pop. There are other ways that you can select your colors for your color grading, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to focus on this one for now. Like I said, in the links below, it'll go into that. Now, you need to choose your color palette with intention because the colors that you opt for are going to impact the mood of the image, the way that your style comes through, and more importantly, the story of the image. For instance, warm colors will put across a sense of energy and vibrancy, think like a summer's day, whereas cooler colors will give you a calmer image, a more serene image, maybe even a more mysterious image, depending on how you use it. So it's important to make sure that you are opting for a color palette that suits the photo that you're using and that tells the story that you're trying to convey. If you're doing portrait work as well, it's also important to factor in your skin tones. Skin tones naturally exist in the sort of the orange to red part of the color wheel spectrum, and that's true regardless of skin type. So whenever you're working on portraits, you want to start off with orange or orangey red as the foundation to your color palette and build up from there. And this is why a very popular color combination is called the orange and teal look, because teal or blue is the perfect complementary color to the sort of the orange red part of the color wheel. And it's the orange and teal look that I'm going to be using as a sort of a rough foundation for this tutorial for the sake of simplicity. Now, another type of color wheel you are going to encounter whilst editing is the CMYK color wheel. You'll find this particularly when you're using the tone curves to color grade, which I'm going to go into later in this tutorial, but the principles are more or less the same, so don't get too caught up in the differences. Again, I'm going to pop a link down below that will give you more information on the CMYK color wheel, and that'll hopefully fill in the gaps of why there's different color wheels and stuff like that. But let's not overcomplicate it today. Let's just hop into Photoshop and have a look at some of the tools that I use to color grade my photos. Okay, so here is the image that I'm going to color grade today. I'm editing in Photoshop, but a lot of these processes can be done in Lightroom as well. I'm going to be using the Camera Raw filter, which if we go to Filter, Camera Raw, is going to pop up a dialog like this, which is pretty much identical to the panel that you'll see down the right-hand side in Lightroom. So everything that I do there, you'll be able to do in Lightroom as well. Anything that's Photoshop specific I will mention is Photoshop specific. So let's do this. So the first process that you can do is to go to the camera calibration, and going off the orange and teal look, which is going to be sort of like the foundation to a lot of the color grading that I'm going to be working on, we can knock the blue primary down to -100 and the red to +50, and then just tweak the saturation from there. Now this is a look of how it is compared to the original image. This is with the camera calibration effect applied, and this is without. As you can see, it has really desaturated our magentas, and that's the thing that you will find with the camera calibration tool is it's going to shift your blues to be slightly more towards cyan, it's going to shift your reds to be more orange, and that's going to affect your greens, yellows, magentas, etc. And that might not be the effect that you're going for, so You might want to use that. It's a very simple way to just sort of get started, but it does have its detrimental effects on the image. If you want to keep that colour popping, it's not going to be the one for you. The next thing that we can do is split toning, which again, if we select that, and what this allows us to do is to add a colour into either the highlights or the shadows or both. Again, if we're going off orange and teal, you can pop some orange in the highlights and just knock up the saturation a little bit. Add in some sort of teal into the shadows, and then you can adjust the saturation sliders as required. You can also adjust the balance. If you wanted the highlights to be more prevalent, you can bring that up, or the shadows, and so forth. And the great thing is that you can really play around with the colours that you want to use. So for instance, I could bring a bit more cyan into the image in the highlights. I could bring in more magenta, and so on. You can really sort of play around with this, and it's a lot more subtle than the camera calibration. Again, I think it's useful when you're using split toning to be thinking of your complementary colours and pick the colours that are opposite each other generally, but you can just play around with it, get experimental. That's usually the best way. And here is a look of how split toning might look depending on the settings that you choose. Again, I've just gone for a very subtle orange and teal look. This time it hasn't washed out all of the magentas, which is very nice. It's just added a slight sort of coolness to the image, which, you know, I quite like. It's a lot more subtle. The next tool that we can use is the HSL slider, which gives us much greater control over individual colours in the image. So for instance, I could single out the blues and bring up the saturation or knock the saturation down. I could single out the reds, do the same thing. You can adjust the luminance of those colours. So say I wanted the blues to be brighter, I could bring that up or knock it down and so forth. Or let's say I wanted to change the colour entirely. Let's say I wanted to shift the blue to be more cyan. You can bring that down, knock it straight down to be more of a green. I could knock up the magentas as well to shift them through more to red. And this is a look of how that can look after you've played around with it for a little while. As you can see, comparing it to the before and after, we have pretty much completely changed the way this image looks by changing the colours. You know, that can look very nice. If that's what you want to do, you can get very experimental with your colouring. You can play around with the saturation and whatnot. You can also use these three tools in tandem to create something that looks like this. Again, because we've used the camera calibration, it has muted out some of the colours. But in terms of the skin tones, it's done very nicely in terms of the skin tones, because again, we've used the orange and teal look, which, as I've discussed before, just really flatters your skin tone. So it's always a good foundation. And the problem with this is it does affect the entire image universally. It's very difficult to single out individual parts of the image. In Photoshop, I could mask it off, and there are masks in Lightroom as well, but it's just a lot of work to really sort of bring that image together. If you like this kind of look, then already it's perfect for you, and that's something that you can experiment with. But there is another tool which I personally prefer, which we could use instead, which are tone curves. Now again, you can find your tone curves in your Camera Raw / Lightroom panel, but when I'm using Photoshop, I prefer to do it as an adjustment layer, which you can create by selecting this little circle down here, just clicking that, and then going up to curves. And this will open up a curve dialog. The reason I prefer to do it this way in Photoshop is this creates an adjustment layer over the image rather than editing the image itself, so I can very easily toggle it on or off or go back into it and edit it really easily. Now the way that the curves panel works is you have this diagonal line which represents all of the tonal range of the image. So you've got your whitest pixels in this top corner, you've got the darkest pixels in this bottom corner, your mid-tones slap bang in the middle, and then all along it is the range in between. And we can make the image either whiter or darker just by adjusting that curve. And that gives us the flexibility to adjust a particular tonal range of the image. So what I would normally do with the curves is create 5 points by selecting each of these quarter points. You've already got the 2 on the ends, like so. And that way I can adjust the mid-tones, the darkest tones, the sort of the mid-darks, your highlights, and your mid-range highlights. Now, the RGB curve will affect everything in either a black or white. It'll either make those pixels lighter or darker. But you can also, using this drop-down menu, select individual color channels. So what I would do is I would start off with the red channel, which gives us the choice between red and cyan. I will make 5 points. And then there's not any hard or fast rules as to how you adjust them. I usually just eyeball it and go off what I like. So I might just start off by adding a little, I'm going to add a little bit of cyan to the midtones. The trick is to be just sort of gentle with it. You don't have to go wild because it's going to make the image just go wild. But you can have a play around with it. I mean, that was pretty cool in and of itself. But I'm going to stick to something like that, I think. Just to add some more cyan to the image. What you will notice is that as you adjust the colors, you will also be adjusting the contrast because, again, using the complementary colors is going to affect the contrast of the image. So just bear that in mind. Once I'm done with the red, I'm going to go to the blue channel, which gives us the choice between blue and yellow. So again, just make my 5 points. I'm going to add some more yellow to the flesh tones just to warm them up a bit. And again, how you play around with it is entirely up to you. What I'll probably do is just add some blues to the mid highlights just to give them some pop. Once I'm done with the blue channel, I'm going to go to the green channel, which gives me the choice between green and magenta. Make the 5 points again. And then finally, just sort of play around with these points. And again, as I said, there's no hard, fast rules as to what you opt for. You can just sort of play around with it and see what you like. Easy as that. And that's the original image, and that's how it's looking now, which I think is quite nice. Now the beautiful thing about curves is because I've done it on an adjustment layer, I can just double click on that and go back into it if I feel the need. I can also just click on the eye and toggle it off straight away, and that's why I love doing it as an adjustment layer. There are also ways that you can just sort of play around with different curves, like I've done one that's a lot warmer. And you can also add a lot of pop to it just by playing around with it. I personally wouldn't go with this kind of style. I've exaggerated it quite a lot. But you can really play around with the style just by using the tone curves. So there you have it, a quick overview of some of the tools that I use to colour grade in Lightroom and Photoshop. Hopefully that's given you an idea of where you can get started with your colour grading. I know it can seem very daunting when you're just starting off with colour grading, but it's not as hard as it looks. And honestly, the best way to learn is to just experiment with it, play around with it, have fun with it. There's so much potential with your colour grading, so it can be so much fun to just try different things and to play around with it. And you'll very quickly learn to develop your colour grading skills in ways that help you tell the story that you want to tell. Now, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, be sure to hit the like button. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment them down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials coming soon. Take care now.